Good morning and welcome to our fifth webinar preparing Tunisian delegation for COP29 at Baku, Azerbaijan. This webinar is facilitated by Dr. Fadhel Kaboub and is about COP29 climate finance negotiations, a global South perspective. Dr. Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and the president of Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He is the author of Global South Perspectives on Subtrack. He is also a member of the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, an expert group member with the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, a member of Earth for All 21st Century Transformational Economics Commission, steering committee member with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, member of the African Forum on Climate Change, Energy and Development, member of the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition Finance, and serves as senior advisor with Power Shift Africa. He has recently served as Undersecretary General for Financing for Development at the Organization of Southern Cooperation in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Dr. Kaboub is an expert on designing public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the Global South, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. His recent work focuses on just transition, climate finance, and transforming the global trade, finance, and investment architecture. His most recent co-authored publication is Just Transition, Climate, Energy, and Development Vision for Africa. He has held a number of research affiliations with the Levy Economics Institute, the John Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, the Economic Research Forum, Power Shift Africa, Africa's Forum on Climate Change, Energy and Development, and the Center for Strategic Studies on the Maghreb. He is currently based in Nairobi, Kenya, and is working on climate finance and development policies in Africa. As an introduction to today's webinar, COP29 is the climate finance COP. Tunisia, like the rest of the African continent, is not responsible for the vast majority of the historic CO2 emissions that are driving climate change. Yet, we face the most devastating consequences of climate-induced extreme weather events like droughts and floods. Because we have not exceeded our carbon budget, we are owed a climate debt that should be paid in the form of grants, not loans, transfer of life-saving technologies to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of climate adaptation and resilience, and cancellation, not rescheduling, of all climate-related debts. Welcome, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, and the mic is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Simonir, and thank you everybody for joining us today for this session on climate finance in preparation for COP29. It's my pleasure to be here, and today I'm speaking to you from Tunis, actually, not in Nairobi. The focus of this COP is climate finance, as most of you already know, and it's been dubbed the Climate Finance COP. One of the reasons is because we have wasted so much time, so many years, in terms of climate action, especially from a global South perspective, in terms of financing climate action at scale, in order for us to meet the climate challenge of keeping global warming below the 1.5 degree limit that most scientists have already told us is already too high. And unfortunately, it looks like we are currently on track to exceed that limit unless rapid and massive action is taken within the next few years, as in before 2030, which is just about 5 years from today. So with that in mind, let me start with a little bit of context for why COP29 is the Climate Finance COP. We are looking at setting a new climate finance target climate finance target that is now called the New Collective Quantified Goal, NCQG. You'll hear this acronym a lot in this COP. And this is to replace the old climate finance target, which was set in 2009. It was supposed to be $100 billion annually that was supposed to be financing from the global north to the global south. Unfortunately, it took more than a decade and a half to finally reach this target, according to OECD countries. But also the reality is that most of this financing, unfortunately, came in the form of loans. The majority of these loans were non-concessional loans, which is very, very problematic because it's debt-inducing climate finance on top of the already difficult external debt problem that many countries in the global south struggle with, including Tunisia. So the focus from a global south perspective for this climate finance target is not just on the quantity, that is the volume of climate finance, but especially the quality of climate finance is going to be very important in the sense that this needs to be new and additional financing. And we've seen in the last several years a very problematic approach by many global north countries that double count and double dip a lot of the financing, mixing climate finance with development finance, with official development assistance, and other programs that are now rebranded and relabeled climate finance. The focus also from a global south perspective that this has to be public financing, would be different from private financing because private financing tends to be extractive because you can't blame private entities, private companies from not wanting to generate profits and repatriate profits to their shareholders. And we want this climate finance to be non-debt inducing, non-debt creating. In other words, grants is important. The level has to be adequate and predictable so that countries can actually make plans, especially if you're talking about structural transformation that requires significant investments over a number of years. You can't just begin certain projects and then without the predictability of finance, you can't really pursue long-term strategic transformative investments on climate adaptation, for example. And you can't just leave projects halfway finished. And we want this, of course, to be channeled through democratic, transparent, and accountable mechanisms on both ends for recipient countries and sending countries. Some of the most important recent development in the climate finance space, as you know, from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh and then COP28 in Dubai, is the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund, or to be more precise, the fund for responding to loss and damage. Unfortunately, the fund only has $700 million in it, which pales in comparison to the estimated needs for loss and damage, which the most recent estimates put it at $580 billion by 2030. So we're not even close. I mean, if you just look at the recent major climate catastrophes that we've seen in Spain, in Morocco, and Algeria with the recent floods and other parts of the world, the loss and damage of every single one of those events is in the billions, not in the millions. So clearly the Loss and Damage Fund is not even close to meeting the needs that we currently have, let alone the needs that we'll see in the future, given that we know that climate change will intensify and increase the frequency of these major climate related catastrophes. From a global South perspective, from an African perspective, adaptation is a major priority as opposed to mitigation, essentially because we haven't been responsible for the vast majority of emissions. So we talk about avoided emissions from an African perspective, from a global South perspective, but our biggest priority is to adapt to climate change. So that led over the last few years to focusing the conversation and efforts from a global South perspective on the global goal and adaptation, and of course, financing adaptation And the most recent adaptation gap report, which I'm happy to share, that it's available online, estimates the adaptation finance gap at 194 billion up to $366 billion per year. So that means that if you compare the 100 billion target that was set in 2009, it's, not even close to being adequate for all the major priorities and needs that we have. And that means that we should be talking about trillions, not billions. And that is at least the starting point. We can quantify how many trillions as we move forward in the presentation. And there are debates about what the quantum should be, and the quality of the quantum. So this is the framing or the starting point for at least where the discussion should be. Not even in the billions, we should be talking about trillions for the most vulnerable countries, for the global south, for Africa in particular. And I'll show some numbers and some references as we move forward. It's very important also to recognize that we've wasted so much time over the last decade at least, with discussions and distractions and full solutions, that we don't actually have any time to waste in the next 5 years in particular. So we can't afford any dangerous distractions, false solutions, incremental solutions that don't really, address the root causes of climate change. And I will list these things. Many of you are familiar with them. Some of you will say, well, these are kind of helpful. They're not necessarily bad, but let's see the bigger picture and see where this is. First, carbon capture and sequestration technology that has been around for a long time, billions of dollars invested in it. Of course, it promotes and extends the life of the fossil fuel industry, which is understandable why many people try to promote this technology. But the thing is, it's too expensive and it hasn't worked at scale yet for the last 30 years, which means it can't be the solution that will save us in the next 5 years. Solar radiation geoengineering, probably the most dangerous thing that you see in this space, which is basically the idea of flying airplanes all over the planet and dropping a small, tiny particles that will reflect solar radiation and help cool the planet. The idea, in a sense, is sort of imitating the effect of volcanic eruptions that creates a lot of dust around the planet and cools down the planet. The problem with this is that the particles that would be used will eventually drop and infiltrate the water system, the entire ecosystem, and have devastating impact on our health, on everybody's health on the planet. And also, it's problematic because you need to do it continuously. Once you start doing this, you have to continuously use the technology for the next 1,000 years. And there are very serious risks in terms of this technology being weaponized against certain regions, certain countries, and so on. So there's actually efforts by the Africa Group right now to push for a non-use agreement, an international treaty that will guarantee that we will not use this technology because it's extremely dangerous. But again, you see a push by the fossil fuel industry to at least test this technology and start using it. Because again, it extends the life of the root cause of climate change, which is the fossil fuel industry. Natural gas as a transition fuel, you hear a lot of discussions about it being cleaner fossil fuel and so on. So I'm not going to go into the debates about it, but this is again not the structural solution that we want. Nuclear energy, lots of debates about, now that we're stuck with a short deadline to meet climate change, maybe we should build up more nuclear capacity. Green hydrogen, and this is really important for Africa and for Tunisia in particular because of the recent green hydrogen contracts and MOUs that have been signed. Very quick 2 words on why green hydrogen is not a good solution, especially for Tunisia, because it uses a lot of water, and we don't have any water to begin with. We were just talking about the water shortages that we have in Tunisia, and countries that are really investing, significant amounts of money in green hydrogen, like Namibia, which is also a drought-stricken country, means that we use seawater desalination to prioritize green hydrogen production for exports, not even for our own energy use, rather than for human consumption for agriculture and so on. And then finally, carbon markets. And this is really the tricky one. Many of us call them pollution permits because of the structure of these deals on a macro scale. And I can refer you to this report we published about a year ago called the Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. And I will go into a little bit of the details of this because this is being pushed as one of the biggest components of market-led climate finance solutions. Simonir, if I can ask for muting the sounds and the background, that'll be great. So let's dive in a little bit on carbon credits from an African perspective or pollution permits. The first thing to recognize is that global north polluters under this model will actually continue their emissions. There is no reduction in emissions for the entities that are buying the pollution permits or the carbon credits. They continue their emissions. So we're not actually advancing our goal when it comes to reducing emissions in the global north. What they do is they buy these pollution permits in order to offset their emissions. So how do we offset the emissions? For example, African countries will designate a forest as a carbon sink and pledge to protect that forest for a small financial contribution. I'll give you an example. The price of a carbon credit in Africa would be $5-6 relative to more than $100 in Europe, for example. So it's very, very cheap credits, carbon credits that can be purchased in the global south. These small financial contributions are typically immediately used by the government to pay for external debt, to service the debt. Very little is actually going to local communities. There are some, successful examples, but they pale in comparison to the larger volume of carbon credits that we see. The indigenous communities who are actually the custodians, the traditional custodians of the forest, are typically displaced from their ancestral land because this land needs to be protected now, so they can't use it anymore. The middlemen tend to collect a lot of the commissions and fees. So there's a lot of market incentive there. And then African countries end up losing millions of acres of territorial sovereignty because you essentially have to pledge to protect that land and stop using it for any purposes, including, for the production of wood, for example. And with the intensification of climate change, because we're actually not reducing emissions, we know that many of these forests will go up in flames. We see forest fires everywhere, including here in Tunisia in the summers, which means all the carbon offsets are eventually released back into the atmosphere, and we're back to square one. So we displace people, we use, these carbon credits as pollution permits for the global north to continue their emissions, and eventually, because of climate change, those offsets are completely canceled out when the forests are actually meeting the ultimate impact of climate change, which is forest fires. So which means historical polluters at the end of the day who have significant market powers, they can actually transfer this additional cost of doing business, the cost of the permits, they can transfer them via their pricing power to their customers. Many of their customers are actually in the global south. So from a macro structural long-term perspective, pollution permits or carbon credits are not actually solving the problem. Yet this is being pushed, especially in the global south, as one of the major options for climate finance. So And a lot of the comments that I'll present today are from this report, which is available online both in English and in French, justtransitionafrica.org. This is a report published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which was convened by Dr. Yuba Sukona, who at the time was one of the vice chairs of the IPCC, Yuba Sukona from Mali. And what we tried to do in this report is produce uh, a coherent, comprehensive, long-term strategic vision from an African perspective that simultaneously addresses climate, energy, and development needs for the African continent, and I should say development and debt needs from an African perspective. But it's also really, once we produce the report, we realize that the structural issues that we address are relevant for the rest of the global south, the majority of the global south, not just for the African continent. And it's been very well received across Africa and the global south. So one of the things that we really wanted to convey in this is that if we as Africans don't have a long-term strategic vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's strategic vision. And of course, every major economic bloc, whether it's Europe or China or the US, has every right to have a vision for itself, has every right to use economic incentives and economic diplomacy to nudge everybody to where they want to see them in their vision. And our point was that we as Africans, we as people of the global south, we also have the right to have our own vision and to use whatever economic incentives and diplomacy to negotiate our way into that space. The reality is that for the longest time, since colonial times, and to this day, the African continent, the global south, has been assigned a particular economic role that is very problematic, actually, from an economic perspective, and extremely problematic for the just transition. And that can be summarized in three major points. Number one, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. Unfortunately, we still play that role. Number two, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global north. Again, we still play that role to this day. And most importantly, number three, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is actually outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, and job creation. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that role today, which means we operate from an economic standpoint today in 2024 under the same colonial structures that were imposed on us. And of course, all of you know that colonial structures were not democratic. Colonial structures were not conducive to development. They were not designed for justice. They were violent, hierarchical, extractive, abusive, non-democratic. So why do we today expect the same violent, hierarchical, abusive colonial structures to produce a just transition or to allow us to achieve the sustainable development goals or to allow us to achieve democracy or human rights or any of the noble goals that we aim to achieve, which means the structural transformation that must happen in order for us to achieve a just transition and development are decolonial transformative investments that will undo this traditional economic role that we have. And that's why we always say that we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Similarly, we can't really democratize a system, an economy that's still technically steered from abroad with colonial structures. And for people who are interested in the conversation about de-dollarization, similarly, you can't de-dollarize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And I'll illustrate with specific examples. So zooming in on the structural economic deficiencies that we must address, must transform in order to achieve a just transition. As most of you know, the external debt problem is a significant burden on all African countries. Just the latest numbers from the World Bank for 2024, this year alone, Africa as a continent is estimated to pay $163 billion in servicing its debt. Only in 1 year, $163 billion. Of course, when you have that level of external debt, it doesn't leave any fiscal policy space for our countries to invest in health or education or infrastructure or climate adaptation. And therefore, external debt is a major obstacle. But what I argue here and what we argue in the Just Transition report, external debt is actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that can be summarized in three major points. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. Number three, low value added industrialization. And I'll explain each very briefly. When we say energy deficits, by the way, and I'll show you some of the numbers for Tunisia, for Kenya, for others, we also include our biggest oil exporters on the continent. Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets, the biggest oil producer. Angola, the second largest oil producer on the continent, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. And this is by design, not by accident. Why? Because in the old energy system that we're trying to get rid of, the fossil fuel system, we've always been denied access to the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. And unfortunately, we also see the same pattern in the new energy system that we're trying to build. We're also being denied access to the manufacturing technology to actually claim our energy sovereignty. In terms of food deficits, Africa as a continent, we import 85% of our food today, when less than 100 years ago, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And of course, you know the problems that we have in Tunisia with food imports, especially the core crops of wheat, for example, and barley and so on. And that didn't happen by accident, because as soon as we started gaining independence on this continent, the major producers in the global north started to heavily subsidize and protect their industry, their agricultural industry. In Europe, for example, we're talking about the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP. And that forced our farmers in the global south to give up producing wheat and corn and the core crops, and to specialize in cash crops for exports like coffee, tea, tobacco, olive oil, cacao, and so on. And that means we produce what we don't consume, and we consume what we don't produce. And that is very dangerous. And it's an economic problem, because it's a major source of external borrowing. And then finally, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have in the global south is the kind where we have to import the machines, we have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, we have to import the fuel to power the factories, and we even import the packaging in some cases, which means the value-added content of what we export is low, the value-added content of what we import is high, which means we're constantly in a deficient position. You can double, triple, quadruple your exports, even you're always locked at the bottom of the value chain. And here's where it becomes economically dangerous, because this type of structural trade deficit, because as you know, no country can function without food, without energy, right? These are foundations, right? With the structural trade deficit, the value of our currency, the dinar, for example, weakens relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. The bigger the deficit, the weaker our currency. And with the weaker currency, and all of us in Tunisia experience this, anything we import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, we end up importing it at a higher real cost, which means we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas, such as food, fuel, and medicine, very basics. And that becomes the source of potential social unrest. That means all of our countries immediately rewire their national priorities in order to subsidize food, subsidize fuel, so we can protect the most vulnerable people, which makes perfect sense. But this is a band-aid solution. You can't subsidize these basic necessities forever. And of course, we also ask our central bankers to do their best to stabilize the exchange rate, to defend the exchange rate. And central bankers also use a band-aid solution. And that solution is to borrow more dollars and more euros in order to stabilize the exchange rate. And that tends to accelerate the external debt problem. And as soon as you have a major external debt problem, your entire economic priorities are now rewired in order to incentivize economic activity that will generate dollars and euros as quickly as possible. And that means lots of extractive industries and lots of, low value added manufacturing. Anything goes, essentially. And that tends to perpetuate the problem. The good news here for us, if we pay attention to the root causes, is that the structural solutions to the debt all of them happen to be climate solutions also, because the energy deficit solution is strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty. That's a solution to the debt. That's a solution to climate. The solution to food deficits is strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology. That's a solution to the debt. That's also a climate solution, climate adaptation solution. And finally, the industrialization trap that we have, the strategic priorities that we should have in Tunisia and the rest of the global south is high value added green industrial policies to prioritize the manufacturing and deployment of renewable energy infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure, all of which is a solution to the debt problem, but it's also a climate adaptation solution. So it's a win-win for us. And that's why when we talk about climate finance and climate action from a global south perspective, we're really talking about development finance. So development finance and climate finance are one in the same and should not be perceived as two competing priorities because they're one and the same. Now, take this to a global scale, just so we see the scale of this problem. If you divide the world into global north and global south and net out all global financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, remittances from workers, even illicit financial flows, everything included, you get the green line. And as you can see, the latest data point that we have is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. That's money moving in the wrong direction. So we have a global structural extractive system financially that is already putting us at a disadvantage before we even talk about climate action. And that's why when we summarize where we are in terms of climate finance, this is where we are. You have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. That's the big red circle there. Next to it, you have the $100 billion that was promised from 15 years ago, and whatever was delivered was mostly loans, not even close to offsetting the $2 trillion. The Green Climate Fund, the last time I checked, the replenishment was about $12 billion, not even close, again, to offsetting the $2 trillion. And of course, the loss and damage fund that we're talking about is $700 million with an M, not even close. And all the other, climate adaptation funds and so on, the amounts are so small. We're not even talking about offsetting the $2 trillion. And of course, you put this side by side with the profits, the annual profits of the biggest oil companies extracting from the continent. You can't even find a single climate fund today that actually meets or competes with the annual profits of these companies. So of course, this is the slide where I ask people to take a screenshot or a selfie with and use this as a starting point for climate finance negotiation. That if we're serious about climate action, we have to address the structural global economic architecture design that is not conducive to meeting the climate change challenge. And that's why we say we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet and transformed yet. So let me zoom in on some of the numbers. This is the African continent as a whole. This is Africa's exports. This is the latest data we have is 2022. The total value of Africa's exports is $767 billion. And you can clearly eyeball the composition of Africa's exports, raw materials, essentially, cash crops, low value added manufacturing. Now, let me show you the imports for the African continent, 886 billion. So we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. And what we import tends to be refined petrochemicals, core crops such as wheat and rice and corn and so on, and high value added content products and pharmaceuticals and so on. Zooming in on Tunisia's case, again, the latest data we have is 2022, the same structural problem. We have, raw materials exports, low value added manufacturing, and crude, petroleum products and refined petrochemicals, for gasoline and kerosene and so on, and pharmaceutical products and high value added manufacturing. Now, look at I'm sorry, I meant low value added manufacturing components, right? Now, Tunisia's imports, and notice the volume. We export 21 billion, we import 26 billion. So structural trade deficit year after year. And the main imports are wheat, corn, barley, soybean, core food products, refined petrochemicals, pharmaceutical products, and typically high value added manufacturing products relative to what we export. This creates this constant pressure on the exchange rate. Again, it's not recent. It's not just because of COVID, or it's not just because of the Ukraine conflict. It's not because of any particular administration, prime minister, or president. This is structural that goes on for decades, not unique to Tunisia. Just as an example, I'll show you Kenya. This is, of course, the rest. The flip side of this is the fact that we need to constantly borrow to finance that structural trade deficit, and that becomes unsustainable external debt. Just to illustrate, I'll show you Kenya. It's just as bad as any other African country. There's no particular reason for showing Kenya. Kenya's exports are 7 billion. Kenya's imports are 25 billion. And now you see why Kenya has a debt crisis. You can, again, see the composition of Kenya's exports: coffee, tea, flowers, fruits, right? And then Kenya's imports tend to be wheat, rice, corn, the priority food items. And you can see the energy content of Kenya's imports, refined petrochemicals, huge imports, and so on. So that means Kenya's exchange rate is constantly under pressure. When the line goes up, by the way, that means the dollar is getting more expensive relative to the Kenyan shilling. And that explains the external debt explosion that you see in Kenya and Tunisia and the rest of the African continent. So these are the structural problems. The structural solutions, as I explained, require cooperation. I'll explain why cooperation for strategic investments is critical, especially on the industrial front. In food sovereignty and agroecology, not just food security. Remember, food security is actually a dangerous colonial concept that was invented in the 60s to convince us that we should prioritize in investing in cash crops, not core crops. Because food security, the technical term, means securing the caloric nutrition of your people, either by producing the food yourself or by buying the food from abroad, or even worse, by borrowing money to buy the food from abroad, which is what you typically use, or even worse, by receiving it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing we can do to our farmers because they can't compete with free food. And that's precisely what happened. We were pushed to believe in this concept of food security, of having to export cash crops in order to buy core crops from the global north. Again, food sovereignty, not every country can produce everything. So that's why we need to think about regional cooperation so that we leverage the complementarity of resources and capabilities, especially with the impact of climate change. Renewable energy sovereignty, which is our biggest potential, as you know, in Tunisia and the rest of the African continent, not to prioritize exports of renewable energy, but to prioritize delivering energy as a building block for development and prosperity and industrialization in our own countries. And that's our biggest potential. And then finally, high value added industrial policies, not just high tech assembly line manufacturing. And I insist on this because the biggest priorities for the African continent is not to manufacture something for other people to consume, but to manufacture the building blocks of development and prosperity, starting with renewables infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on this continent who are inhaling toxic fumes every day, mostly women and children, because of lack of clean cooking infrastructure, and green transportation infrastructure to build the logistics for our cities, for our economies across the continent. Why Pan-African regional cooperation is important, is a necessity actually, is because there is no such thing as industrial policies in a small country like Tunisia. Because to industrialize, you need economies of scale. You need to manufacture large volumes of the same unit in order for you to reduce the cost per unit, improve efficiency, and really have the full benefits of industrialization. Otherwise, if you're industrializing as a small country or like Tunisia, then we have to rely on exports in order to reach those economies of scale. And of course, with exports, good luck competing with made in Germany, made in Japan, made in China today. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible. However, if we have regional cooperation with countries at the same level of development, with countries that need the same infrastructure that we need, then you have a market share of, say, 500 plus million consumers. Then you can reach economies of scale. You can have multiple manufacturers competing and deploying resources at scale within that regional bloc. So Pan-African industrial policies and regional cooperation is actually an economic necessity. It's not because we like each other that we cooperate. It's because we have to, because we have no other option. And here, the advantage that we have on the African continent is that we have all the critical minerals that we need for real industrial policies. We have the economies of scale as a block of countries, and we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. What we do lack is access to the manufacturing technology, which is why, as part of the climate negotiations, the debt negotiations, we should be fighting as a bloc for joint venture partnerships with countries that actually have the technology and are withholding the technology from us. And I'll tell you why they're withholding the technologies for a very simple reason. The latest report on Africa from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, essentially said that by 2040, Africa as a continent can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs, 1,000 times, and completely replace all the fossil fuel exports from the continent. So this is technically within reach if we actually have the manufacturing technology. The reason this is being perceived as a threat, as a risk to be managed and minimized, is because this will completely disrupt the global economic hierarchy. Imagine the power of OPEC countries today, the oil exporting countries, their geopolitical weight, their economic weight in the energy system. Imagine taking that and multiplying it by 1,000. That's Africa's potential. And that's Africa's potential to be energy independent and to truly industrialize, to escape the colonial bottom of the economic hierarchy trap. And that is unfortunately being perceived as a risk, as a threat to be managed in order not to disrupt the global hierarchy, instead of it being perceived as a wonderful opportunity, a win-win for everybody. Because who are we going to sell our industrial and our energy surplus to? Of course, it's going to be countries that are energy deficient and will produce the cheapest and cleanest energy system on the planet. And I'll show you the map later to demonstrate that. So this structural transformation that we're talking about requires not just transformation of global financial architecture that's primarily with the World Bank and the IMF, but it also means transforming the international trade and investment architecture. That's the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and of course the international taxation architecture, which for the longest time was in the hands of the OECD until last November, thanks to the Africa Group and the rest of the G77, we managed to vote for the creation of a UN tax convention framework, which is being negotiated as we speak. And that's the process of transforming taxation. We still need to fight for transforming the rules of trade and investment and financial architecture. So now, the mainstream climate finance, this is the dominant frame that we've been subjected to in the past. And this is the frame that we need to fight to change in this COP in Baku in next year in Brazil and beyond. So the framing from a global north perspective is no grants. They say we have no money, no reparations. We're not going to admit that we overconsumed our carbon budget and owe you climate reparations. We will just prioritize market-based greenwash solutions. And I explained some of those. Concessional loans to some extent are allowed, but again, they're still loans. De-risking for foreign investors is a big priority for Global North. They're saying, we'll bring the private sector, but you, the Global South, have to de-risk. In other words, you have to provide so many guarantees for them, especially exchange rate guarantees, because this is the biggest risk they perceive, so that they can repatriate their profits at a fixed exchange rate or a favorable exchange rate. I mentioned pollution permits as a big priority, and the so-called green industrialization. Green industrialization, as framed by the Global North, is also a very dangerous solution to climate finance, because I'll give you one quick example. The green steel investment in Mauritania, for example, huge renewable energy infrastructure to produce steel, which is very energy intensive, as you know, but the steel is not for the Mauritanian economy. The green energy is not for the Mauritanian economy. It's to produce green steel that can be exported to Europe without paying the CBAM tax, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism tax, which means the green industrial production that's happening physically in Mauritania is actually an inflation management tool for European economies because they bring in the steel at a lower cost because they don't have to pay the tax. And it's actually a trade weapon against their competitors in Brazil, in Korea, and Japan, and other markets who now can't export steel to Europe without paying the CBAM tax. So that is not designed to develop Mauritania. Mauritania is still locked at the bottom of the global value chain and is still on the receiving end of green energy extractivism, or what we call decarbonization by dispossession. And unfortunately, these are all labeled climate finance solutions. And that's what we want to expose and try to undo these climate finance traps. Climate finance, from a global South perspective, should be thought of in the following manner. And I'll show you the data in the next couple of slides. Countries in the global north have exceeded their carbon budget by far, which means they owe a climate debt. And the concept of debt in economics and finance and law is very straightforward. If I owe you $100, I have to pay you $100. That's very simple. We can sit down and negotiate a payment plan, but at the end of the day, I give you $100 and you don't have to give me anything. That's what debt is. But instead, this is how the system works today. If I owe you $100, I must pay you $100. That's the logic. But instead, here's how it works. I give you $3 and I tell you exactly what to do with it. Impose conditionalities on you and threaten to stop the payments. And then, of course, $3, we know it's not enough for climate finance. So I will lend you $7, concessional rates, right? Noblesse oblige in this case. And again, I still tell you what to do with the $7 and impose restrictions and conditionalities. And then I give you $10, but you have to give me your forest for pollution permits. And then I invest $8 in your economy, but you have to de-risk my investment for green hydrogen, not for your economy, but for my economy. And then I invest another $12, but you have to become my CBAM partner so that you produce the green steel for my economy, not for your economy. This is CBAM. CBAM, by the way, is a European Union carbon border adjustment mechanism. The US, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, all of them are preparing to launch the equivalent of CBAM soon, which means that after all of this, you're looking at me and saying, wait a minute, where's my $100? I thought you're supposed to give me my $100. I'm not supposed to borrow money from you or give you my hydrogen or produce steel for you. You're supposed to give me $100. So this is what we end up with. The current climate finance framework is a greenwash, rinse and repeat of the same colonial economic architecture with market-based economic entrapment, false solutions that don't actually deliver the quantity or the quality of climate finance that we should be fighting for. And that's exactly what we need to be exposing in this COP and beyond. So the science behind this is that, again, there's a very simple concept that all countries agree to, which is the carbon budget. The global north has exceeded its budget. We in the African continent, we have produced actually less than 4% of global emissions. Less than 4%. That's the equivalent of Spain alone, actually. And yet we face the most devastating consequences of climate change. So the concept of climate debt means that the global north owes the global south climate debt. And one of the most recent estimates for this puts the volume of climate debt at $193 trillion. The study is available. I'm happy to share the link with you. This is a quick summary of the study. You see that dotted line in the middle. Countries in the green zone are countries that did not exceed their carbon budget, and countries in the red zone have exceeded their carbon budget. Of course, you probably know that the two biggest sticky points in this argument from a global north perspective is that, as you can see, China and India would be recipients of climate reparations because technically they haven't exceeded their carbon budget yet. Yes, they're major polluters today, but this is a recent phenomenon, right? For the longest time, China and India were actually poor developing countries that did not contribute to climate change. But it doesn't mean that China and India shouldn't double, triple, quadruple their efforts today to reduce their emissions. They have to. But technically speaking, they did not exceed their carbon budget yet. Which means if you summarize the technical aspects of these calculations, these are the countries or regions that should be paying for climate debt, and these are the recipient countries. But just for a moment, if we just ignore India and China, just remove them from the list, let's say we convince them they will not receive any climate reparations. The sub-Saharan region of the African continent alone is owed $45 trillion. These are calculations, by the way, between now and 2050, right? The rest of the global south is owed $74 trillion to be paid between now, that is between 2020 and 2050, over a 30-year period. And that means, even if you eliminate the sticky points, there is still the case for major climate debt payments, again, in the form of the following form that I'll describe. And that's why many organizations across the global south and the global north a few weeks ago launched this campaign, which you can look up on social media, hashtag PayUp, is for a minimum of $5 trillion per year in grant equivalent form to be paid as a good faith down payment, just as a starting point towards this major climate debt. And I'm happy to give more details about this campaign. That when you go to COP, you'll see the civil society action around the $5 trillion. Again, moving from billions to trillions, but this is the quantum that many global South organizations, including Climate Action International, which is a network of more than 2,000 climate organizations around the planet, APMDD, the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, which is a network of more than 5,000 organizations in Asia, Third World Network, Power Shift Africa, and so many other climate and development and debt organizations are calling for this amount. Now, what is the content of this climate finance payment? It should be debt cancellation, not restructuring and rescheduling. And here we mean debt cancellation of all debts related to climate borrowing. Number two, grants, not loans, and further economic entrapment. And number three, and most importantly, transfer of life-saving technology to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of development and prosperity. As I mentioned earlier, renewable energy production, public transportation, green public transportation, and clean cooking infrastructure, and the building blocks of climate adaptation. This is not an exhaustive list, but the fact here that we have an opportunity because of all the resources that we have the youngest labor force on the planet, on the African continent, all the resources we need the manufacturing technology to put in place the building blocks of climate resilience and adaptation. And this is just to illustrate, as you can see, the African continent has the largest potential for renewable energy on the planet. Coincidentally, we also have all the critical minerals. This is a map of the key critical minerals, the majority of which are in the global south. Africa is clearly blessed with these resources. Again, the reason we emphasize on South-South cooperation, because not every country has everything in terms of resources or human capabilities and solar potential, wind potential, but together as regional blocks, we complement each other in so many productive ways. So now the question becomes, how do we create the fiscal policy space? Are countries fiscally prepared? Here we're talking about countries in the south, but also countries in the north, because they keep saying, we don't have any money. It has to be the private sector. It has to be Wall Street. This is the framework that I'll present here that will show us that we can actually create the fiscal policy space in the north and in the south without bankrupting countries, without causing massive inflation, and so on. And I'll close with this. And this is the concept of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Some countries have a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. That's the US, that's Japan, that's the UK, China. And some countries have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. countries that can't even print their own national currencies, like the CFA franc countries, like Senegal, for example, doesn't even have a national currency. Most of our countries, like Tunisia, are countries with a limited degree of monetary sovereignty. And the idea here is, what are the strategic investments that we can put in place in order for us to acquire over time higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty? Because the stronger the degree of monetary sovereignty, the more fiscal capacity a country will have to invest in health and education and climate action. So here's the traditional thinking, is that countries can spend their tax revenues, they can borrow up to a certain limit, a relatively small amount, but beyond that, they can't spend, right? And here we're talking about countries in the south and in the north. And the argument is that if they keep borrowing more or spending bigger and bigger deficits, they will have inflation or even hyperinflation. The argument that I'm presenting here is that we do actually have this additional fiscal policy space, that bright yellow space, that is not infinite, it's not unlimited, it's actually constrained. Some countries have a small yellow space and some countries have larger yellow space, but every country has additional spending capacity that we're not always tapping into. The question is, what determines the risk of inflation? How do we know how far to go before we go bankrupt, before we cause hyperinflation or even inflation? So the focus of a lot of my work and my colleagues' work is on what determines the risk of inflation. And this is critical for not the economics alone, but also for the climate action thing. So what determines the risk of inflation are two things. Number one is lack of productive capacity, logistics, supply chain disruptions, skilled labor, right, and technological capabilities. The good news about this is that these are producible skills, producible resources, which means if a country is spending more and it's outpacing its productive capacity, it will face inflation and it shouldn't spend more. But if the spending is targeted towards building that capacity, then you actually mitigate the risk of inflation and can increase your fiscal policy space. The second risk of inflation is what we call abusive market power and price setting behavior. That is, if you have key individuals, domestically or internationally, who can raise prices simply because they can, because they have market power, then any additional spending will cause inflation. So how do we mitigate this abusive market power and price setting behavior? Is not by not spending, but you mitigate it by taxing and regulating this market power out of existence, which means you democratize your economy domestically and internationally. And that's the authority of government regulatory agencies in order to mitigate this monopoly power and oligopoly power and so on. So the model here is that if we strategically invest in key areas, in our case in Tunisia and Africa, that's food and energy. If we invest in building productive capacity in the major areas of inflation risk, that is food and energy, then we actually increase our fiscal policy space. And if we regulate abusive market power, monopolies, and so on, then we actually mitigate the risk of inflation and can increase our spending capacity without causing inflation. I'll give you an example to illustrate. And this is really the economic paradigm shift that we're advocating. And this is true for global North countries. The more they do this in terms of democratizing their economies, democratizing the global economy, and building additional productive capacity to mitigate inflation, the more they can afford to transfer technology and to invest in the global south and to actually pay for their climate debt. So the framing, I have to admit, is non-mainstream, because to say that we increase government spending to fight inflation, this is completely unacceptable in the standard economics framing. But here's an example. This is the mainstream approach. Let's say in the case of Tunisia, I'm just making up this number, just a hypothetical. If Tunisia decides today to spend 5 billion dinars, and we actually do have essentially allow the central bank to finance the deficit. Let's say this passes, right? This is what mainstream economists tell you today, that this is a very bad idea. This is going to cause massive inflation. This is the logic of their thinking. So they say Tunisia spends 5 billion on health and education, which means we import more food, more energy, more medical equipment. That means a larger trade deficit, which means a weaker dinar relative to the dollar and the euro. The exchange rate will weaken, and we're going to have an inflation pass-through effect, even hyperinflation, because we import food, we import energy, we import medical equipment, all of which becomes more expensive with a weaker dinar. And that means more external debt. The IMF and other foreign lenders will mandate spending cuts. So we go back to austerity to reduce spending on health and education. And that means more unemployment, brain drain, social, economic, and political tensions. We're back to square one. And that's why they tell you you shouldn't even try to do this because it's very dangerous and it doesn't actually help you advance. And we're told there's no alternative. This is the old phrase from Margaret Thatcher. There is no alternative to market mechanisms. Now, here's the second scenario, the alternative approach. I'm using the same numerical example. Let's say Tunisia still wants to spend 5 billion dinars. Again, this is not in US dollars, this is in Tunisian dinars. But now we're spending it more strategically. So we're going to spend 2.5 billion on health and education instead of 5. The other 2.5, we're going to spend it to increase domestic productive capacity of food, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and crack down on corruption, abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation. So technically, it's the same amount of deficit spending, but it's strategically targeted. Now, here's what we're going to see. Fewer imports of food and energy because we're producing more locally. A lower trade deficit, which means a stable or even stronger exchange rate relative to the dollar and the euro. No inflation imported via food and energy, a lower external debt and higher credit ratings over time. The central bank will have more foreign currency reserve because we're not using as much to import. And we're going to have more resilience to external shocks, such as food and energy security problems that we've experienced, a lower carbon footprint because we're producing things cleaner and domestically without a shipping carbon footprint. And we have more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for all. Now we're talking. We spent 5 billion more and we've addressed some key structural issues that are related to the debt, and all of which is also climate adaptation, investments in food sovereignty and renewable energy sovereignty and so on. The question becomes for Tunisia, is our fiscal limit actually 5 billion or is it 5.5? Maybe it's 7, maybe it's 10. How do we know? We go back to that same frame. If we have the administrative, logistical, and real resource capacity, the skills, the technology to administer more of the spending, then we can. But if we've exceeded our limits or reached our limits, then any additional spending will actually be inflationary and will be counterproductive. But the point here is that as we build this productive capacity, over time, we increase our fiscal spending capacity and we'll start to structurally transform the country from a debt perspective, but also from a climate perspective. So to conclude here, so we can open for questions, the time to act is now. There is no climate finance option for 2050, 2060. We have to really nail this in this COP and at the most in the next COP in Brazil. The climate crisis, the poly crisis that we're dealing with, to be honest, calls for urgent, bold, and radical action. And when I say radical, I don't mean it in the political sense. I mean it in the literal sense of the term. Radical means you go to the roots of the problem. And if we're not addressing the root, then we're operating at the surface. And any surface level intervention is called superficial intervention. And superficial intervention reproduces the status quo. And we just can't afford the status quo on the climate front or on the economic front. So the current climate finance framework that I described is just not going to deliver any meaningful climate action. And that's why we mean radical transformation that refocuses the climate finance debate towards a just and equitable transition, and climate reparations cannot happen without an economic and geopolitical leverage, which means we as people of the global south, we need to operate as a block of countries, whether it's the Africa group, the Arab group, ultimately the G77 block is the block that needs to speak with one voice on climate finance to set the new framing that I described today. And to be honest, a realistic plan for this structural transformation and decolonization requires a fundamental restructuring of the global economic architecture. And this is something that we've tried working on and successfully have put at the center of climate negotiations is the importance of reforming, but we should be really saying transforming the financial architecture, but including the rules of trade, the rules of investment, and the rules of international taxation. And I truly believe that a transformative Pan-African Global South just transition framework is not only morally necessary, scientifically sound, ecologically mandatory, but it's also politically feasible if we operate as a bloc, legally desirable, so we can have an orderly just transition, and economically unavoidable. And as I've demonstrated today, I can also argue that it's financially affordable. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Fadhel, especially clarifying the structural issues the Global South is facing, and especially Tunisia. The floor is open for questions, actually. So probably we can stop sharing screen so we can see the faces. Thank you. Any hands up? Zuhair? Or was it a mistake, probably?
سي محمد تفضل.
Thank you so much, C. Fadhel, for this presentation. I think it's amazing as always. I have a little question regarding your opinion when it comes to climate finance and the scope expectations, specifically that in the geopolitical aspect that we are experiencing in Ukraine and in Palestine right now, and the US elections will be next year. So what is your expectation, and how do you evaluate the main outcomes of this scope when it comes to the new collective quantified goal on climate finance? And thank you so much.
Thank you. Very good question. Actually, the US elections are happening tomorrow, so we'll find out very, very quickly. So I'll start with the geopolitical context as in the US, because it's the most important heavyweight in terms of climate emissions and potentially climate finance and historic responsibility. It's very clear that if Donald Trump wins the elections, that we will see a repeat of what he did immediately after taking office, which is to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement and completely disrupt the entire climate negotiations process, and for an entire 4 years derailed everything. So we should expect something like that, and that will be that means the rest of the world will have to step up somehow, because we can't afford another 4 years of delay. If Kamala Harris wins, then you will see still the same kind of engagement, that we've seen in the last 4 years, which means nothing really transformative. Kamala Harris made it very clear that the US will not stop investing in fossil fuels, and especially in natural gas. And that is very problematic for the largest historic polluter to continue on the same track. If you remember, I don't know if you were with us in the first session that we did with this webinar series, I showed the production gap report, the summary of the production gap report, which shows that we are currently on track to extract and burn twice as much as we're allowed to by 2040, 2050, which means from a scientific perspective, we should be, number one, not adding any new fossil fuel infrastructure. Number two, we should be phasing out rapidly all the existing fossil fuel infrastructure under a just transition framework, which means who should be phasing out first? It's the largest polluters. It's the countries that actually have the alternative technology and the financial capabilities, which means the US should be the country that's phasing out the most rapidly immediately. Of course, A just transition framework means countries in the global south who have fossil fuel infrastructure, they're not being asked to phase out their fossil fuels yet, because they haven't exceeded their budget and they don't have the alternative yet. And that's where climate finance comes in, is to finance the construction of the alternative. In terms of the geopolitics of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, that is, sucking a lot of financial resources, both from the US, but especially from the European Union. And as a result, that's all investments away from, the fiscal policy space that's being consumed by conflict, right? And of course, the conflict in, or I should say, to be very clear, the genocide in Palestine that is being funded both by the US and Europe to some extent, it's also consuming additional fiscal policy space from urgent global priorities and causing this catastrophe in Palestine and Lebanon and beyond. But there is another geopolitical dimension that I want to put on the table for us. I didn't include it in the presentation because it would have taken us to another dimension. But of course, this is, as I've highlighted in some aspects of this presentation, that the key component of this negotiation cannot succeed from a global south perspective, because you can go and make the moral argument, the legal argument, the historic argument, the scientific argument. At the end of the day, you can't force the other side to pay, right? Because they don't have to, right? Because they're in a position of power. You can't force them to transfer technology because they don't want to, because it's disruptive, not just from a financial standpoint, it's disruptive to the global hierarchy, because it unleashes the power of the global south to become an industrial powerhouse, to be a competitor, right? And we're the region of the world that has all the resources that they want, right? So in order for us to change that bargaining position, we have to have a geopolitical leverage. And that geopolitical leverage can be created today in the following manner. Imagine for a moment, if we have a block of African countries, it doesn't have to be all African countries, a block of global south countries. Let's say we have 30 countries who agree as a block to have a joint industrial policy, to use the critical minerals, the complementarity of resources and capabilities, to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure. They have all the resources, but they don't have the manufacturing technology. Imagine that block going to China, which is a country that has the entire value chain that we want to replicate, with the bargain of the century, what I call the bargain of the century, and say, look, here's what the offer is. If you transfer technology to us, this block of 30 countries, and then replicate the entire value chain of manufacturing solar panels, for example, just solar panels for now, here's what we give you. We give you, number one, you have the opportunity in 10 to 15 years to double your industrial footprint globally. Number two, you double your geopolitical weight globally. And number three is secure access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about, that we have. In addition to that, thanks to the trade restrictions that the US and Europe is putting on Chinese electric vehicles and batteries and high-tech products, we say, look, we in this global south bloc, we're the global majority. We have the biggest market on the planet, bigger than Europe, US, Australia, Japan combined. Except we have a problem. We don't have purchasing power yet. But if we truly industrialize, we become the biggest potential market for Chinese EVs and investments and so on. So I guarantee you China will accept the bargain, will transfer technology as in joint venture partnerships, right? Just triggering the process of this bargain with China, real development, immediately gives us the bargaining chip, the geopolitical leverage that we need to change the conversation with Europe and the US and the rest of the global north by saying, look, we will give you the same bargain. If you transfer technology for wind turbine technology on our terms in the global south, as in joint venture partnership, we're not saying we're stealing your technology. Come be our real partner, right? And of course, at that point, the global north cannot say, no, we don't transfer technology. Because if they say we don't transfer technology, say, okay, fine, we'll give this deal to China because they have wind turbine technology. They have high-speed rail technology. They have pharmaceutical technologies, all of which we want to build as a building block for our transformation. So that immediately creates a scenario where we're not actually putting China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather putting ourselves as a bloc at the center of a new international economic order. We become the arbiters of an international trade, investment architecture, and geopolitical architecture. And it's actually based on stability, right? It's not based on one power dominating the others. So that is the ultimate leverage point, because once you do that, then you can force the negotiations about climate finance, about debt under a completely different scenario. But today, the reality is we can go to COP and ask for 5 trillion, 1 trillion. We can go to COP tomorrow and ask for $10. I guarantee you we will get nothing because we have no leverage. So we have to create the leverage as a block, and that leverage can't be narrow in the climate finance space. It has to be truly transformative across the board, because this is a question of power. Because Africa today, with all the renewable energy potentials that I mentioned from the IRENA report, Africa attracts less than 2% of financing for renewables globally. Most of the 2% is actually extractive, and we have no access to the manufacturing technology. It's actually explicitly behind closed doors. This is the position of the OECD. We will not transfer technology because that is disruptive, right? So how do we change their position? You have to change it with the geopolitical leverage. I hope it's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fadhel. Thank you so much. That was really amazing, and I hope that we continue our discussion at COP, inshallah, in Baku in 2 weeks. Inshallah.
Thank you, inshallah. See Rafiq.
Shukran. Thank you very much. Fadhel, I discovered, Fadhel, we need to upload to give you claps. No, really, it's very useful for us. My request for you, is it possible to speak in French for other colleagues? They are not very comfortable with the English.
Yes, French, English, Arabic, Arabizi, anything, as long as we deliver the message.
Okay, the second request is your presentation. Is it possible to share it with us?
Of course, I'll share the slide.
It will be very... ok. Et Simonir, merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité. Moi, je suis ébloui par ce qu'il a dit, parce que c'est le cœur. On est en plein. On est avec le groupe africain, avec les collègues Richard Sherman, Zahir, all these guys on financial.
C'est Rafiq, all of the colleagues with you, Ambassador Ali Muhammad and
Ali Muhammad, also our chair.
Sister Fatuma Hussein, they're all my colleagues.
Fatuma, they are with us now. So, juste pour vous dire que vous savez très bien que dans les négociations, on ramène pas de l'argent. C'est que, comme vous venez de le dire, c'est de préparer le terrain et de forcer les pays du Nord, les pays développés, disons industrialisés, pas développés, sur le dos des autres, de les pousser à mettre l'argent, comme vous venez de le dire. Et le groupe africain, on vient de discuter sur notre stratégie pour l'NCQJ surtout. It's not the problem of the quantum, it's the problem of the quality, it's true. Mais le problème, vous savez très bien qu'en Afrique, on est organisé par l'AMSEN. Okay. And chaos before for all others. Pourquoi? Parce que le problème s'est soulevé aujourd'hui avec la biodiversité, avec désertification des 2 autres conventions. Et on a trop parlé dans la biodiversité de beaucoup de choses, surtout drought problems and issues. Et on s'est demandé tout à l'heure avec tout le monde, avec Richard et Ali Mohamed, comment faire la synergie alors que la Convention 4 des changements climatiques, dans l'article 2, elle part de la synergie entre les 3 conventions. Et vous savez très bien que les deux autres conventions sont les pauvres conventions. Il n'y a que dans le climate change. Donc,
Ouais.
how to deal with this? Cette problématique, on doit la soulever ensemble et y aller, comme vous venez de le dire, une seule voix, one voice.
Yeah.
Comment le faire? Ça, c'est Moi, j'ai vu notre position en tant qu'AMSEN et après la position en tant qu'AGN Climate Change. Il y a un autre AGN sur la biodiversité, autre AGN sur la désertification, autre AGN sur je ne sais quoi, sur le plastique, l'autre. Oui, mais c'est là.
Ouais.
Comment faire pour arriver à ce que vous venez de proposer comme financial solutions? C'est ça notre problématique. Donc, est-ce que euh, vous avez une proposition pour qu'on puisse aller avec une seule voix? Avant de terminer, passez le bonjour à Yoba Sokona. Il était notre enseignant climate change depuis 30 ans. Donc, on se connaît très bien.
Ouais.
Voilà. Merci.
Yeah, Isaac. You just put your finger on all the important issues, and it's the number one issue is an issue of coordination. In order for us to speak with one voice, we have to coordinate, and the silos between all the different AGN groups, AGN climate, AGN plastics, AGN biodiversity, the negotiators don't even know each other, right? And sometimes they're in the same country. So I think structurally, from an administrative organizational perspective, it's the African Union CAHOCs that could be the hub for coordinating at the highest level. And then the instructions need to go down to all the national level AGN members to start coordinating. There's a challenge with CAHOCs because it's, the African Union is to some extent underfunded on the climate funds and on the climate front and disorganized, but also to some extent funded too much by the European Union. And as a result, there's a lot of influence not to do that, because why would the Global North Bloc fund a coordinated effort by the Africa Group to do exactly what we're describing here? So we shouldn't expect Europe to fund this level of coordination. The other option that we have is AMSEN, the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, where our ministers need to be at the national level very thoughtful in coordinating national level single voice position on climate, on biodiversity, on plastics, and all of this. The challenge with ministries of environment across the African continent is that their jurisdiction, their portfolio tends to be limited. And the way I described the structural transformation that is needed on the climate front, as you can see, it's about industrial policy. It's about energy policy. It's about, management of natural resources beyond the traditional portfolio of ministries of environment, which means our ministers of environment need to be in direct communication with ministers of energy, of trade, of industry, and of course, ministers of finance, because this is all about finance at the end of the day. If we succeed at doing this at the national level, then we can go to AMSEN or CAHOCs as individual countries that are structurally organized in understanding the interlinkages between all of these spaces, so we can build that. So it's work from below at the national level. We need to do this homework, which we typically don't do. Ministers are still siloed in their portfolio. And it's also structural at the African level, at the AMSEN level or CAHOCs level, so that we can get the level of coordination. And that's why we're not really advancing in this space. We hope that at least the Africa Group at COP can raise the structural issues and alert national governments that this is the approach we need to be taken, but at least as a bloc, start to negotiate in a way that inserts the climate finance transformation that we need in the way that I described today. But I completely agree with you that there are so many structural connections that are still missing, unfortunately. The plastics treaty, which is actually more advanced than any of the climate negotiations, because the plastics treaty that is being negotiated Now, Inc. 5 is happening at the end of November, right after Baku. It has an actual mandate to create a legally binding financial instrument. I mean, if in this COP we can get to a legally binding financial instrument, we'll be dancing on the tables. But the Plastics Treaty already has a legally binding mandate because there was a General Assembly resolution that all countries agreed to, that they have to create a legally binding financial instrument to phase out plastics. So we need to have a similar instrument in the climate space that says we want a legally binding financial mechanism to phase out fossil fuels and to actually invest in adaptation. We don't even have the legally binding language on the table yet. It's all voluntary at the end of the day. So that's a huge win on the plastics front. That's not finished yet. But most of our countries are not even paying attention to how important that precedent is to create a legally binding financial instrument, hopefully at the end of November.
We have a question from Si Walid Shawish.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Fadhel. It was really very interesting and very instructive. And I like your strategy about playing the China versus the Europe and the US. I think it's very, very clever. You just said that unity is very important to achieve this goal. And you said that we are very far from this unity at the African level. You spoke about what about uniting with Latin America and countries from Asia? I think we have the same probably problems and objectives.
Absolutely. It's like you've been looking at my travel schedule the last 12 months. It's actually the Latin American countries that are most interested in this united front approach, and they're the most willing. If anything, the hesitation is mostly on the African side because of the vulnerability that we have, geopolitical, debt vulnerability, so much interference in our domestic affairs and pressures, which means very few countries will be willing to stick their neck out in a assertive way, and they will wait for that critical mass to be built in order to join. Which means the first movers will be the most politically courageous, audacious countries, and that's really the coalition that we're working on, is to get to that critical mass. So far, nobody said this will not work, but everybody knows that it's a heavy lifting. It's because you're about to disrupt the global hierarchy, right? And the other side will not just sit and watch you do it. You know what happens. So that's the challenge, right? But this means that we lay out a strategy and say, look, this is technically possible. This is within reach. This is our full potential. And then we focus and shine this bright light on the actual obstacles, domestic and international, and you start, galvanizing your efforts to undo some of those obstacles one at a time in a cooperative way, in a careful way. That's the heavy lifting.
Yeah, last question from Dr. Nihal.
Dr. Nihal, Fadhel.
Thank you, Fadhel. En fait, it's not going to be a question, just actually a comment, because I know that we are going to meet in Baku, so actually we will have a long discussion. Typically, I mean, I've been working on these topics, considering that I did my PhD on critical accounting and deconstructing neoliberalism and all these things. I mean, I would like to thank you for this amazing presentation, and mainly actually the big picture that you make us see, what is behind all the complexity and all the way how things are structured to make things difficult actually to understand and difficult to to change. But I think actually, and having been in this world, for so many years. I think actually there is also another approach besides the fact that we need to, to have like a common agenda and to be united. I think actually something which is very important is also to be able to use the instruments that are there, but to somehow actually to use them from inside. Like, okay, we need to change things, but also we need to know how to play with what is there, because there are also opportunities to do it. And we can talk about carbon credits specifically, because this is an area in which I was extremely interested, and I spent a lot of time in Africa also trying to understand, what is good for African citizens. And I think actually we can play and use it for our benefits. It's not all like to throw away, but actually to be able to understand where are the problems and how actually we can address them. But again, keeping in mind the big picture that you showed us today, because that's at the end of the day the compass.
Absolutely, completely agree, and I'm looking forward to getting into the nuances and the details and the tactics that we need to put together. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lihal. Thank you very much, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. I think we are 10 minutes over the time allocated, but it was really inspiring and interesting. We look forward to meet everyone in Baku, right?
Inshallah, yeah.
Are we all going there?
Not me, but I wish you a lot of luck.
Thank you.
Actually, our side event will be live streamed, so you can be with us if you wish.
Okay, I will. So I will, with pleasure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub and everyone, and see you in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Thank you. Bye-bye.